polytheists of Mecca did everything they could have done to assassinate the messenger of the God, to prevent him from migrating to Medina. But their every attempt failed, and these failures were unpalatable for them. Ever since the migration of the messenger of the God, the polytheists of Mecca were scheming and preparing to attack Medina. While Muslims were in Mecca, the God forbade Muslims to fight even in self-defense. As Muslims were few in number and helpless, fighting even in self-defense could have been fatal. In Mecca, Muslims had no choice but to accept the oppression, or to migrate. But, after migration to Medina, the God allowed the Muslims to fight for their right, justice, and to defend themselves. The God revealed, "Permission to fight has been given to those who are being fought, and were wronged. And indeed, Allah, the God, is able to give them victory. They are those who have been unjustly evicted from their homes, only because they say, 'Our Lord is Allah, the one true God.' And were it not that Allah tests one set of people by means of another, there would have been demolished monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques in which the name of Allah is much mentioned. And Allah will surely support those who support Him. Indeed, Allah, the God, is powerful and exalted in might." In the year 624 CE, the polytheists of Mecca were preparing for a great attack on Medina. And they were gathering every means to strengthen their army. A caravan of Mecca was bringing great provisions from Syria to Mecca, with only 40 guards. This information reached the Muslims, and they thought, this is a good opportunity to mend for their lost wealth in Mecca. As the Muslims were extorted by the polytheists of Mecca before the migration to Medina, Muslims had to leave their all lands and properties in Mecca. And if the Muslims are able to overtake this caravan, it will delay the attack from Mecca, and prevent the army of Mecca from getting more powerful. So the Muslims prepared an attack on the caravan. The Muslims were able to gather only 310 men, 60 from the Muhajir, and 250 from the Ansar. As there were only 40 guards with the caravan, the Muslims thought 310 men were sufficient to overtake the caravan, and the Muslims would have the upper hand. Unfortunate for the Muslims, the leader of the caravan of Mecca learned about this attack through his scouts, and brought the caravan back to Mecca by a different route. Meanwhile, when the caravan was returning Mecca, the polytheists of Mecca also learned about the preparation of attack by the Muslims on their caravan, and the polytheists of Mecca sent prepared 1,000 soldiers to eradicate the Muslims, and kill the messenger of the God. After reaching Mecca, the leader of the caravan sent scouts to the leaders of the polytheist army, to return Mecca, as the caravans have safely returned Mecca, but the leaders of the polytheist army saw this as a grand opportunity to kill the messenger of the God and eradicate the Muslims. The two armies fought at a place called Badr, and with the mercy of the God, the army of Medina defeated and humiliated the Meccan army. On that day, the Meccan polytheists suffered great losses. 70 from amongst their ranks were killed, many of whom were nobles and leaders from the tribes of Mecca, and 70 more were taken captives. Only 14 were shaheed, from amongst the Muslims. In the 6th century CE, war captives were either killed brutally or were enslaved and thrown into the life of hardship forever, but in Islam it is forbidden to treat inhumanly anyone. When the terms captives and enslavement are used in Islam, they are not meant in their conventional sense. In Islam, when enemies are captured during war, they are taken as captives, to ensure that the enemies do not get the opportunity to reorganize themselves and attack the Muslims again. Manifest guidelines have been given to the Muslims regarding the treatment of captives in the Quran, and the authentic hadith of the Messenger of the God. The guidelines for treatment of the captives are as follows. Prisoners of war should not be killed unless they are guilty of war crimes. It is prohibited for Muslims to commit zina, adultery, fornication etc., or rape. It is illegal to separate related captives or prisoners of war. The captives should be guarded but not ill-treated. The Messenger of the God urged the Muslims to treat the captives well and give them priorities over themselves. The captives must be clothed and fed well in a dignified manner. Captives can get their freedom in any of the following ways. Captives can be ransomed for money. the money demanded will depend on the financial background of the captive. Captives may be set free after they have provided some sort of service to the Muslims for a determined period of time, for example, teaching Muslim kids to read and write, etc. Captives who swear that they will never raise their swords against the Muslims will be set free. Slave traders are considered as criminals in the Islamic society. Muslims are not allowed to enslave anyone, and are encouraged to banish the slave trade, if they had the authority. According to the hadith, the Messenger of the God said, "The God will be the opponent in the afterlife, of those who sells people for a price." Therefore the Muslims are not allowed to enslave anyone, and sell them for a price. But, if Muslims do not possess the authority, the Muslims are allowed to buy slaves from the slave traders, and it is encouraged in the Quran and Hadith to manumit the slaves, and manumitting slaves are considered as deeds of great piety in Islam. The captives and slaves can only be held as a paid worker, under the surveillance of a Muslim guardian, and according to the Quran, there shall be a written contract, mentioning all the clause about their work, salary, and the price of exemption from the hold. The guardian will also have to share their wealth with their slaves or captives, hold workers, on a reasonable basis. The guardians are not allowed to compel their captives or slaves to commit sins or crimes, steal, prostitution, murder, etc. But, if any guardian forces his or her slave, or captive, to commit a crime or a sin, and if the captive or the slave helplessly commits it, the captive or the slave will be free of guilt, and sinless, and the guardian will be charged with the crime, and the guardian will be sinful. The God have provided manifest guidelines by His Messenger, regarding the treatment of bought slaves and war captives. The ruling of bought slaves and war captives are: a slave or a captive has to maintain conditions with their guardian. There are two ways in which a slave or a captive is employed with their guardian. The guardian will be responsible for the livelihood, education, marriage, protection, etc., for the slave or captive, and the slave or captive will work for his guardian. The slave or the captive will live as a freeman, earn their own livelihood, work according to their own choice, but will be responsible and provide for the livelihood of the guardian. Sometimes the slaves were more enriched and solvent than their guardians. If any slave or captive disagree with the arrangement with the guardian, then they can go to the court or a judge for justification. The Messenger of the God also said the following regarding the slaves: "Your slaves are your brothers, and Allah has put them under your command. Whoever has a brother, that is a slave, under his command, should feed him of what he eats, and dress him of what he wears. Do not ask your slaves to do things beyond their capacity, and if you do so, then help them. Ask for their slaves help in what is too much for you, and help them in what is too much for them. If anyone murders or injures his slave, then the perpetrator of the crime will be penalized with capital punishment, or will be punished with the same injuries that the perpetrator has done to the slave. If somebody slanders his slave, then he will be flogged on the day of resurrection, unless the slave is really as he has described him. He who hits a slave, the expiation for it is that he should set the slave free. Not one of you should say, 'This is my slave,' or 'This is my slave girl.' He should call them 'my daughter,' or 'my son,' or 'my brother.' The Messenger of the God encouraged masters of female slaves to teach the slaves good manners, and to educate the slaves in the best possible way, and manumit and marry the slaves. In Islam, it is prohibited for both men and women to have sexual relations with anybody outside marriage. Masters of the slaves are not allowed to have sexual relations with their slaves, if they are not married. But the masters may marry the slaves, if the slaves consent to it. The slaves can marry anyone of their choice, but with the permission of their masters. Allah the Almighty has encouraged the freeing of slaves, and the expiation of many offenses is freeing of slaves. The Muslims treated the polytheist captives of the Battle of Badr in accordance with the guidelines ordained by the God. The Muslims would share the better part of their food with the captives, and share their animals as ride with the captives. Thus the captives were impressed by the generosity of the Muslims, and many among them accepted Islam. Many of the captives were ransomed for money, depending on their financial conditions. The Muslim converts from the Badr captives decided to stay in Medina, even though their family tried to ransom them, and take them back to Mecca. Another form of ransom had an educational dimension. Most of the captives were well educated, so they were entrusted with 10 Muslim children, and once these children learned to read and write, they were set free. Some captives were also set free when they swore that they would never raise their sword towards the Muslims again.